Welcome to Electrified. My name is Dylan Loomis. In this episode, we'll go over everything you need to know from NIO's Q2 Earnings report. If you missed the episode yesterday about NIO, it was essentially a crash course on the company, and I was definitely a bit skeptical on some of the gross margin numbers. I have to say, after just getting off the conference call, these Q2 numbers are seriously impressive. And I will absolutely admit I may have been wrong. It almost feels like some of these numbers, the books have been cooked. I'm not arguing that, but it's just a very, very big turnaround that I was not expecting. In addition, there is some huge news from the Q&A section of the call, especially regarding the battery as a service model and some government policy changes. So make sure you stick around to the end to catch that news. Without further ado, let's jump into it. If this is your first time on the channel, typically I do edit my videos to make them more visually stimulating. However, I'm foregoing all of that in this episode just to get you this information as quickly as possible, so please bear with me on that front. I have my notes here from the call, so at times I will be reading. Once again, hopefully you can overlook that and focus on the information. So NIO delivered over 10,000 units, which was an all-time record in Q3. Specifically, they delivered 3,335 units in July. Their ES6 is the top-selling electric SUV in China. However, we need to remember there is another electric SUV coming to the market, Tesla Model Y, so we'll have to keep an eye on those sales figures moving forward. They set new Q3 expectations of between 11,000 and 11,500 deliveries, and they have new revenue guidance of between $572 and $596 million expected, which would be a 8 to 13% quarter-over-quarter increase. Their average sale prices have increased. They did have recall one-time costs in Q2 2019 that did of course affect their margins. That was removed, so as we'll get into, you'll see some very, very strong gross margin numbers. Specifically, they were 9.7%, which turned positive for the first time in company history, so this is massive, massive news. Their vehicle margins were 8.4% positive, and the guidance was only 5% positive, so they crushed these expectations. They did set new guidance for the back half of 2020 in terms of gross margins, and they should be 10% or higher. Due to an increase in deliveries, they had positive operating cash flow once again for the first time in company history, so this is excellent. In terms of R&D, they have accelerated new product development and autonomy. Their EC6 was officially launched July 24th. It's been very well received so far. They'll be going into production soon, and they expect deliveries to begin in September of this year for their new EC6. Current production rates are between 15 and 20 units per hour, and they're expecting a target capacity of 4,500 to 5,000 units per month from one shift. There was some massive news on their battery as a service in the Q&A section, so I won't touch on it here. Stick around until the end to hear that news. NIO's user base is continuing to expand, and we need to note that NIO is a luxury electric vehicle maker, which is relatively new for the Chinese market. This is key because brand and status are very important to the Chinese consumer, which is where I think personally the NIO houses and NIO spaces could be a long-term competitive advantage in the long run. If you're not familiar with what those are, go back and check out the episode from yesterday on NIO. So the revenue for Q2 was $526 million, which was a 146% year-over-year increase and a 171% QOQ increase. The revenue is broken down into two different sections. They have vehicle revenue and other revenue. The other revenue is composed of things like service and energy packages, accessories, and home chargers. In terms of gross profit, they did $44.3 million positive gross profit, 162% year-over-year increase, and a 286% quarter-over-quarter increase. Of course, some of this was due to constraints from Q1 due to the coronavirus, but still very positive. Gross profit was driven by an increased sales numbers and increased gross margin numbers, which the gross margin was positive 8.4%, vehicle margins positive 9.7%. This is compared to negative 22% from Q2 2019, negative 22% to positive 9%. That's beautiful. We love it. The margins were driven by lower manufacturing costs and higher production volume. In addition, they didn't have the one-time costs from the recall back in Q2 2019, so this also was less pressure on their margins. They had a net loss of $166 million, which was down 60% from the same loss Q2 2019. improvements here as well. Their cash and cash equivalents were $1.58 billion as of June 30th, 2020. Getting into the Q&A, this part was awesome. There was some big news here. Gross margins on the ES8 are of course higher than the ES6. They won't divulge details, but it's important to know that. Their R&D should be expected to be normalized around $75 million per quarter, and this is broken down into vehicle R&D and autonomy R&D. Of course, the vehicle figure is much higher. Once again, they did not want to give specifics, but it's good to know. Currently, they have a 200-person team, which is 1/6 of their R&D cost, working specifically on autonomy. Their autonomy is called NIO Pilot, and they made a comment that I loved. They gave credit to Tesla and said they're not as good as Tesla yet. This is big. No American OEM has even come close to tipping their cap to Tesla, so I really love this out of NIO. And the saying, the rising tide lifts all boats or ships. Well, in this case, it feels like Tesla is doing this with the EV market in China and specifically with autonomy. As these other companies are comparing themselves to Tesla, they're praising them and doing everything they can to get on their level. This is great. The take rate for NIO's autonomy system is 25%. They do have a Founders Edition that actually comes standard with their NIO Pilot. They have a next generation platform in development dubbed 2.0, but they didn't want to give any information yet as it's too early. They were the first manufacturer to use Mobileye's Q4 chip in the ES8 back in 2018, giving them a 1-year lead on other manufacturers using that chip. And real quick, I do want to say thank you to those of you who took the time to provide very insightful comments on the Chinese government and the Chinese EV market. I don't proclaim to be any expert yet, as I've only been in this space for a couple of months. However, I am very willing and I try to be humble to always learn and keep an open mind. So I am willing to admit if and when I was wrong, and I've never been to China, so there's only so much I can know from doing research. So thank you to all of you who keep me on my toes. I really, really appreciate that. NIO will actually not be using the level system for autonomy like level 2, level 4. They're actually focused on 2 key areas. One is how much time they can save the driver, and 2 is how many accidents they can reduce. So don't expect NIO to put themselves in any place in terms of level 3 or level 4. They don't think that that has any real practical application. They're focused on those 2 aspects. There was a question on international expansion, to which NIO said, of course, they do have plans to do so eventually, but this year has not been the year to do so. They are researching the international markets to figure out what is the best way to proceed, but they ask for our patience with this topic. Once again, updated gross margin targets for the back half of 2020, they're expected to be 10% or higher. Their average sale prices are expected to remain stable in Q3 and Q4. They should be able to reduce battery pack costs. More on this to come. And there are also questions on a new plant and a new facility, to which NIO said, thus far, they've been able to release 1 new product per year, and you can expect this cadence to continue. People really want a sedan from NIO, which is going to be in their product pipeline very soon. Once again, they ask for patience. They will need a second plant eventually, but their production with JAC has been great, and there is still room for improvement at the first production facility. This means there's no immediate need for a second facility, but it is in the cards at some point in the future. In passing, they mentioned a 150,000 unit capacity on 2 shifts for an annual run rate. There was a great question from Alex Piper with regard to regulatory credits. Of course, Alex is well versed in Tesla, so he's transferring some of that knowledge to NIO. So NIO does plan to sell regulatory credits in Q3 and Q4, which should very much help with gross margins. They plan to include these regulatory credits as part of their gross margin, not their vehicle margin like Tesla does. These regulatory credits are expected to replace subsidies in a sense, and there should be trading between OEMs of these credits in the Chinese market. NIO said that each vehicle sale is roughly 6,000 RMB in regulatory credit revenue, which is about $868 US. As mentioned, this was the first quarter for positive operating cash flow for NIO, a very strong sign. This was driven by low operating losses, and they were able to negotiate payment terms with suppliers. They went from previously 60 days to now 90-day credit terms, and they also will accept notes instead of just cash previously. This is huge and shows major supplier confidence in NIO. And also, using the direct sales model has been very beneficial for their margins. There was yet another question on production capacity, and NIO said they have 4,500 to 5,000 monthly unit production targets. They do have a huge ES8 order backlog. The EC6 is going to be ramping in the imminent future, and deliveries are expected to start in September. They're accumulating orders now, and there will be Q4 pressure to produce units with the release of the EC6, which is why they're focused on increasing production capacity. Now, getting into the massive news from this Q&A section, the battery as a service plan. If you're not that familiar with NIO, make sure after this video you go back and check out my video on NIO yesterday as I talk about the battery as a service and the battery swap stations. The short of it is they now have government approval to sell their cars without a battery. Well, Dylan, what does this mean? Basically, they're going to use the battery as a service, so they'll sell their vehicle without the battery, meaning there's no cost of the battery in the car. This will of course save the user a ton of money up front, and instead of the user paying roughly 358,000 RMB, it would go down to 268,000 RMB, so 100,000 RMB per car. This is due to new policies from the government, and previous restrictions are now gone in terms of insurance and financing, so they now have the green light to move forward with this battery as a service. And one key point, NIO is not the main stakeholder in owning the battery assets. They're basically going to have something you can think of like a subsidiary that owns the battery assets, and that company will in turn lease the batteries to the user. So this division of the company won't actually have a material impact on the company's numbers. But this battery as a service is going to be huge going forward. Of course, there are people on both sides of the fence in terms of if it's a positive or a negative. I think the jury is still out. I can definitely make arguments for both sides. But wrapping all of this up, these numbers were so impressive to me coming off of Q1. I really did not think there was any way they were going to turn gross margins positive in such a short time. It's feeling more and more like there are so many positive factors working for NIO that over the next 3 to 5 years, they could return serious value to shareholders. Of course, it is still a speculative investment, but these Q2 numbers were excellent. If you guys have any questions, leave them below. If you're still here, like this video if you did. I really appreciate it. Consider subscribing if you're not already. If you have other videos or other topics you'd like to see, let me know, as I do read and try to respond to every single comment. Hope you guys have an excellent day. I'll talk to you soon.